So we are going to talk about inverse functions. So when we find inverse functions, we're finding the inverse of something that is already a function. So when we talk about the inverse function, we want to look at the whether or not the inverse is going to be a function also. So what we want to know is the function one-to-one? And what one-to-one means is essentially that it's a function, but kind of backwards. So we know that a function is that for every input there is exactly one output. But one-to-one means that for every output there's exactly one input. So the way that we find that is we use the horizontal line test. So you know from Algebra 1, from Algebra 2, that the vertical line test helps us decide whether or not something is going to be a function or not. Now if we want to know if the inverse is a function, we're going to use the horizontal line test to decide if the inverse is going to be a function or not. So over here is a cubic function. And if we have our horizontal lines going through there, it never touches more than one point on that graph till the inverse is going to be a function. On our absolute value function over here, since our horizontal lines go through and touches more than one point when it goes through, it does not pass the horizontal line test. So the inverse will not be a function. So what we want to know is we only want to find the inverse of functions where the inverse is also going to be a function. So if you come across something on your homework that the inverse is not a function, don't find it. There's no point in it. So here's how you find the inverse of a function if we know that the inverse of that function is also going to be a function. You're going to switch x and y. Now remember, we don't usually set them equal to y because we call it f of x. But f of x is just function notation for y. Different names for the same thing. So you're going to switch your x and y, and then you're going to solve for y. And then after you solve for y, we want to name it f inverse of x. It's written f with a little -1 for an exponent of x. Now, I like to say that mathematicians would really like emojis because we like to put as much information into as little text as we possibly can. So function notation, the reason we call things f of x instead of just y is because we get to say that that is a function in terms of x. So now with this, just that f -1 of x, we get to know that this is a function which is an inverse of x, or inverse of f in terms of x. So that little bit just gives us a ton of information about that function. So here's an example of how you would find it. So let's say that our f of x is x, the square root of x minus 5. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at that graph. Now if you're not sure about it, just graph it out in your graphing calculator and take a look. Just go through with your finger and see if it passes the horizontal line test. We know what a square root function looks like. This is just shifted over to the right 5. And so we know that when we have a square root function, it's going to look something like this. So we're going to go through with our horizontal lines. It doesn't touch the graph more than once as it goes through. So yes, the inverse is going to be a function. So we had y, essentially y equals the square root of x minus 5. So then we switched our x and y. So we had x equals y minus 5. So the way that we get the square root of y minus 5. So the way we get rid of a square root is we need to do the inverse operation of it. So the inverse operation of square root is squared. So the golden rule of algebra is do unto one side as you do unto the other. So if you're going to square the right side, you're going to have to square the left side too. Since they're inverse operations, that square root and squared are going to cancel out. So now I'm left with x squared equals y minus 5. So since we want to get y by itself, we need to add 5 on both sides. So then we have x squared plus 5 equals y. So we got y by itself, our job is done. We know that the inverse function is going to be x squared plus 5. So we want to say that it's the inverse function. So that's why we have the inverse of f, or the f with a little -1 of x, equals x squared plus 5. So tomorrow we're going to be talking about more about this, so come in prepared to be able to do your bell work and get these guys out of the way. See you later.